What happens when trust is shattered and love is tested to its breaking point? David thought he had everything, until the truth came crashing down. A child who isn't his, a wife's betrayal, and a past he can't outrun. Can he find redemption? Or will the weight of the lies crush him? Watch as secrets unravel and emotions collide in this gripping tale of love, loss, and the hardest choices of all. Will forgiveness be enough? Or is it too late for a second chance? Where will you stand when the truth is too painful to accept? David Callahan sat at the kitchen table, his eyes scanning over the familiar routine of the morning. The soft hum of the coffee maker, the sound of Noah's laughter echoing from the living room, and the scent of toast made it feel like any other day. He was used to this calm, comfortable life. His world was predictable, grounded in the smiles of his wife, Sarah, and their son. But today, something was off. David's gaze lingered on the pile of papers left on the counter. Among them, a single document caught his eye. It wasn't something he recognized. A DNA test result. Curiosity gnawed at him, and without thinking he reached out, his hands trembling slightly. He turned the paper over, scanning the contents. The numbers blurred for a moment, his eyes struggling to process the data. It wasn't until he saw the final line that everything stopped. Noah Callahan. Paternity. Negative. His breath caught in his throat. He reread the sentence. His heart pounded in his chest. He stood up quickly, the chair scraping across the floor with a loud screech that echoed through the otherwise quiet house. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The words hit him like a freight train. The world around him felt as if it were spinning. His son, the boy he had raised, loved, and cared for, wasn't his. His mind raced. He tried to make sense of it, but the pieces refused to fit together. His hands shook as he placed the paper down on the table, but his eyes couldn't tear themselves away from the cruel, undeniable truth printed before him. Noah wasn't his. The laughter from the living room suddenly felt like an invasion. David took a step forward, then stopped, his heart hammering in his chest. He had to speak to Sarah. He had to understand. But what could she possibly say? The anger, the confusion, the hurt? It all twisted inside him, making it hard to breathe. He walked through the house, finding Sarah in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. The scent of eggs and bacon filled the air, but it couldn't reach him. His thoughts were a storm, raging too loudly for him to focus on anything else. "Sarah," he said, his voice suddenly sharp, pulling her attention. She looked up, her face lighting up with a smile, but when she saw the look in his eyes, her smile faltered, her expression turning guarded. "David, what's wrong?" she asked, setting the spatula down, concern creeping into her voice. David didn't answer immediately. He simply held out the DNA test result. The silence between them grew heavy. "David, Sarah's words faltered as she saw the paper, the blood draining from her face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears already welling in her eyes. "What is this, Sarah?" David's voice cracked, but the anger in it was undeniable. "What is this? You let me believe he was mine, all this time." "I didn't mean for it to happen," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "It was a mistake I can't undo." David took a step back, his body feeling like it was made of stone. "A mistake?" he repeated, disbelief in his voice. "How can you call this a mistake, Sarah? You've destroyed everything." "I never meant for this to happen," she said again, her voice breaking. "It was a moment of weakness. I didn't know how to fix it." David felt the ground shift beneath him. He took another step back, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion, rage, and hurt. "You didn't know how to fix it? What does that even mean, Sarah?" His voice was raw, edged with fury. "You've ruined everything, Sarah. Everything I've built, everything I've trusted. It's all a lie." He looked down at the paper in his hand again, as if he could will the truth to change, but it remained the same. Noah wasn't his. And the truth, that sharp, painful truth, shattered the very foundation of the life he thought he knew. David couldn't breathe. The weight of the truth pressed down on him, suffocating every thought, every ounce of reason. Sarah stood in front of him, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock and guilt. She had confessed everything, but it didn't make sense. How could this have happened? How could she have kept such a monumental secret from him for so long? He stared at the DNA test result in his hand as if willing it to change. But it remained the same. Noah was not his son. "David!" Sarah's voice cracked, breaking through his spiraling thoughts. "Please, say something." David turned away from her, the surge of anger bubbling up, mixing with the overwhelming sense of betrayal. He couldn't look at her. He couldn't stand to be in the same room with her. Not right now. Not with everything she had just admitted. He walked across the room, each step feeling like it was dragging him deeper into an abyss. He didn't know what to do, where to go. The foundation of his entire life, his marriage, was crumbling before him, and he couldn't stop it. Sarah's voice came again, softer this time, as if afraid to break the silence that had enveloped them. "David, I never wanted this to happen. I never thought it would end up this way." He turned to face her, his eyes burning with fury and hurt. "How did it happen then, Sarah? How did you let it go on for so long? You slept with him, you—" His voice broke, a mixture of disbelief and anger threatening to consume him. "How could you lie to me, to Noah, to our family? How could you betray us like that?" Tears streamed down Sarah's face. She stepped forward, reaching out as though to touch him, but David recoiled, instinctively pulling away. The gap between them felt like an ocean, wide and unbridgeable. "David, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, but it was a mistake, a moment of weakness. You don't understand, Her voice faltered as if she knew nothing she said would undo the damage. He took a sharp breath, his hands shaking, the weight of the DNA test still in his grasp. He couldn't bring himself to speak. He was too angry, too devastated. All the love he had poured into their family, into Noah, was built on a lie. The person he thought he knew better than anyone had shattered that trust in the blink of an eye. "Explain it to me, Sarah," David said, his voice tight with restraint. "Explain how this wasn't a choice. How can you call it a mistake when you knew exactly what you were doing?" Sarah's sobs grew louder, and David couldn't bear to listen. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the sound of her pain, but it only made his own hurt more intense. How could he ever forgive her? He didn't know if he could. "I was lonely, David," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I was so lonely. I thought I was losing you. I thought we were growing apart, and Michael, he was there. I never meant for it to go that far." David's jaw clenched. He didn't want to hear her excuses. He didn't want to understand. He had given her everything, and she had betrayed him with someone else. "You thought you were losing me?" David repeated almost incredulously. "You think that justifies what you did? You think that makes it okay?" He turned away from her again, pacing back and forth as the flood of emotions began to overwhelm him. Anger, betrayal, confusion. But underneath all that, the overwhelming feeling was pain, deep, gut-wrenching pain. "I thought you loved me," David said, the words barely escaping his lips. His voice was raw. "I thought you loved me, and I trusted you, Sarah." "I do love you," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never stopped loving you." David let out a bitter laugh, a sound filled with so much hurt. "Then why? Why didn't you tell me the truth? Why did you let this go on?" He looked back at the test result one more time as if searching for an explanation, something that could make sense of the chaos unfolding before him. But there was nothing. The truth was inescapable. "Noah's not mine," David said, the weight of the words sinking into him like a dagger. "You've destroyed everything." Sarah's knees buckled and she collapsed onto the couch, her sobs turning into a quiet wail of regret. "David, please, I'm sorry, please don't leave me." But David was already moving toward the door, unable to stay another minute in the house that no longer felt like home. "It's too late for apologies, Sarah. It's too late." He slammed the door behind him, the sound echoing through the house. And as he walked away, the thought of what he was leaving behind, his family, his life, felt like a wound that would never heal. David's life, once anchored in the warmth of a home filled with laughter, now felt like a distant memory. His move to a new city had been a desperate attempt to escape the wreckage of his past. Everything, his old job, his old life, was gone. He rented a modest apartment in a part of town far from where he once lived, where no one knew his name or his story. The apartment was bare. He had only the essentials: a bed, a small couch, a few items of clothing. There was no family photo to remind him of what he'd lost, no signs of the life that used to be. Each day he woke up, went to work, and came home to silence. He had no idea how to start over, but it was all he could do. The pain of his past haunted him, but the emptiness of his new life made it feel almost bearable. He poured himself a cup of coffee one morning, staring at the reflection in the kitchen window. His face looked older, the lines more pronounced. His eyes were harder, colder. He felt as though he was living in a version of himself that didn't belong to him anymore. The phone buzzed on the table. He stared at it for a moment before picking it up, knowing who it was even before he looked at the screen. Sarah's name flashed across the screen. For a moment, David's heart skipped. Then it fell into the pit of his stomach. He hadn't spoken to her since that day, the day she had shattered everything. Every message, every phone call he had ignored. He couldn't bring himself to face her again. The weight of the betrayal still clung to him like an invisible chain. David's finger hovered over the screen, his mind torn. Finally, he swiped it away, not wanting to deal with the emotions that would inevitably flood in. He had spent weeks trying to numb himself, to build a life that was distant enough to forget. But each time Sarah reached out, it was like the cracks in his heart deepened. He thought about Noah, the boy he had raised, the child he loved with everything he had. It felt impossible to accept that Noah wasn't his son. But it wasn't just the blood test that stung. It was everything else. The lies, the secrets, the years of devotion that had been thrown away like they meant nothing. David looked at the phone again, then stood up, walking over to the window. He could see the street below, people walking by, living their lives. It seemed so far removed from the turmoil he felt inside. It wasn't that he wanted to forget Sarah. It was that he needed to protect himself, to rebuild, to find something, anything, that could fill the hole she had left. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. David froze. His heart skipped. He hadn't been expecting anyone. He walked to the door slowly, his hand trembling as he turned the knob. He opened it, and there she was, Lily, his old colleague, a nurse and Sarah's best friend. Lily didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, her expression a mixture of concern and pity. It had been over a year since David last saw her. After Sarah's betrayal, he had cut ties with everyone who reminded him of his old life. But now, standing in front of him, Lily seemed to carry the weight of the past on her shoulders. "David," she said quietly, "can we talk?" David stepped back, allowing her to enter. There was no warmth between them anymore, only the awkward tension of old memories and shared pain. Lily looked around the apartment as if unsure of how to begin. "I've tried to reach you, but you've been avoiding me," she said, her voice soft. "I get it. You're angry, but you have to understand that Sarah, she's falling apart. She's been asking about you, about Noah. She misses you." David shook his head, not ready to hear it. "I can't just pretend that nothing happened, Lily. You don't know what it's like. She betrayed me. She betrayed Noah." His voice cracked as he said the name, but he quickly suppressed the tears that were threatening to rise. "I know," Lily said gently. "But David, you can't shut yourself off from everyone forever. You're punishing yourself just as much as you're punishing her." David's fists clenched at his sides. "I'm not punishing her," he spat. "She did this, not me. I trusted her and she destroyed everything. I've got nothing left to give her." Lily's expression softened. She took a step closer, her voice lowering. "You're not the only one who's hurting. Sarah is struggling, David. I've never seen her like this before. She made a terrible mistake, but she doesn't know how to fix it. You might not ever forgive her, but you can't keep hiding from the truth. You loved her once, and you still love Noah. That's what matters now." David's heart tightened at the mention of Noah's name. He did love Noah. He had raised him, cared for him, given him everything. But now all of it felt like a lie. "I don't know what to do anymore," David whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to forgive her. I don't even know if I can forgive myself." Lily gave him a sad smile, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. Just take it one day at a time, for you, not for her." David looked down, taking a deep breath. Maybe Lily was right. Maybe he didn't need to have it all figured out. But the pain was still there, gnawing at him, and the question of what to do next lingered in the air like a weight he couldn't escape. David sat alone in his apartment, the weight of the silence pressing in on him. The emptiness of the space mirrored the emptiness he felt inside. His thoughts, a constant swirl of anger and confusion, made it difficult to concentrate on anything. He had wanted this life, hadn't he? A fresh start away from the pain, away from Sarah and Noah. But now, all he could think about was the life he left behind. The son he thought was his and the woman who had torn everything apart. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a message. Sarah. He had seen the name too many times, but this one felt different. There was an urgency in her words. David, I need to talk to you. I don't know where to begin. I've made so many mistakes, but I can't live with the guilt anymore. Please, just let me explain. His heart tightened. He had heard these words before. Apologies that meant nothing now. Words were empty. Actions, however, were what mattered. But still, the part of him that once loved her, the part that had once believed in their future, stirred. He put the phone down, trying to ignore the growing urge to respond. But it felt like a tug, a pull at his heart. He knew what it would mean if he responded, what it would cost him. There was a knock at the door. David froze, his pulse quickening. He had been expecting nothing, had convinced himself that the past was behind him, but now in that moment reality struck. He opened the door slowly, and there she stood. Sarah. She looked different, tired, worn out. The years had etched more than just time into her face. Her eyes were red from crying, her expression desperate. She looked nothing like the woman who had once been his partner, his confidant. "David," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, let me explain." David stepped back, his mind racing. He had heard enough explanations, enough broken promises, but he couldn't look at her without remembering everything. The family they had built, the love they had shared, and then the betrayal, the lies, the affair. "Sarah, you've already explained. I don't need to hear it again," David said, his voice cold, guarded. The anger he felt was still raw, but something else lingered beneath it. A deep sorrow that refused to be silenced. "No, you don't understand," Sarah said quickly, stepping inside. "I've been trying to fix it, but I can't. I've been living with the guilt of what I did. I don't know how to make it right, but I need you to know that I'm sorry, David. I never meant to hurt you. I never thought it would go this far." David shook his head, feeling a surge of frustration. He took a step back, his chest tightening. "It's too late for apologies, Sarah. You don't get to just come back into my life after everything. After what you did, you think a few words are going to make everything okay?" Sarah's face fell, and her tears began to spill. She reached out, her hand shaking as she tried to touch his arm, but David pulled away instinctively. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," she said through her tears, her voice breaking. "I'm asking for a chance to explain, to make things right, even if you never forgive me." David stared at her for a long moment, his breath shallow, heart pounding. He wanted to yell, to scream at her, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he stood there, motionless, the silence between them heavy. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," he finally said, his voice raw. "But Noah, he deserves to know the truth. He deserves to have some closure. We both do." Sarah nodded, her eyes desperate. "I know, David, I know. I've been trying to reach out to him, but he won't talk to me. I don't know how to fix this, but I can't live with the guilt anymore. I can't keep pretending like everything is fine when it's not. Please, don't shut me out." David's heart twisted as he looked at her. This wasn't the same woman he had married. The woman standing before him was broken, lost, and maybe even more so than he was. But he didn't know if that was enough for him to let her back in. He glanced at the floor, at the empty space around him that felt colder than ever. "You broke this family, Sarah. You broke everything. And I don't know if I can ever pick up the pieces again." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The pain was too deep, the distance too vast. But then Sarah spoke again, softer this time. "David, I've ruined everything, but I'm still here. And if you can find it in your heart to let me try, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." David closed his eyes, fighting the tears that threatened to fall. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know if he could believe her. But one thing was clear. He had to find a way to move forward, no matter how difficult it was. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again," David whispered. "But I'll think about what you said. That's all I can promise." Sarah took a shaky breath, nodding. "That's all I can ask for." And with that, she turned and left, leaving David standing in the silence of his new life, not knowing if he would ever find peace again. David sat in the dim light of his apartment, the world outside moving on while he remained stuck in the same place, paralyzed by the weight of the past. The silence of the room pressed in on him. He hadn't expected to feel this empty after everything, after leaving, after cutting ties. He thought that escaping would bring some relief, some distance from the unbearable truth Sarah had revealed, but it hadn't. Nothing had. He hadn't spoken to her since she came by a few days ago, pleading for a chance to explain herself. He still couldn't get her words out of his mind. "I'm sorry," she had said over and over, like those words could undo the betrayal, but nothing could undo what she had done. David closed his eyes, letting the bitterness of that truth consume him again. He had once been the man who would do anything for his family, who loved his son with all his heart. But now, the world he had built felt like a lie. A knock at the door startled him out of his thoughts. He stood up, heart hammering in his chest, dreading the possibility of it being Sarah again. He didn't want to see her, didn't want to hear her excuses. Yet, as he reached for the door, his mind raced with what he would say if it was her. What could he say to make her understand how deeply she had cut him? He opened the door, and to his surprise, it wasn't Sarah. It was Lily standing in the hallway, her face etched with concern. "David," she said softly, stepping inside when he didn't immediately respond. "I know this isn't easy, but you need to talk to her." David shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want to talk to her, Lily. Not now, not ever. What's there to say? She ruined everything." Lily's gaze softened, but her tone remained firm. "I get it, David. I really do. But she's not the only one hurting. You're not helping yourself by shutting everything out." David's frustration flared and he took a step back, running a hand through his hair. "You don't get it. I gave her everything, my love, my trust, and she threw it all away." "I know you're angry," Lily said, her voice steady but gentle. "But this anger, this pain, it's eating you up. It's not helping anyone." David couldn't answer right away. The anger was too much, the betrayal too raw. It was hard to let go of the rage that had taken hold of him. But Lily was right in a way. He could feel it inside of him, the weight of it all, the burden of carrying this grudge, this heartbreak, every single day. It was exhausting, and yet he didn't know how to let it go. "I don't know how to fix this," David whispered, his voice breaking. "How do I fix something that's been shattered beyond repair?" Lily stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't fix it. You move on. You let go of the things that are destroying you, David. It's not about fixing Sarah or what happened. It's about fixing you." David exhaled slowly, the pain cutting through him with every breath. He had tried so hard to keep it together, but he was falling apart, piece by piece. And now Lily's words hung in the air. "Fix yourself." But how? How did he fix something so broken? "I don't know if I can ever forgive her," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to forgive her," Lily replied. "Not yet. But you do have to forgive yourself. You can't keep living in this prison of guilt and anger. You deserve peace, David." David's chest tightened at her words. Peace? What was peace anymore? Peace felt like a distant dream, an unreachable place. His life had been torn apart in ways he hadn't even thought possible. But as Lily's hand lingered on his shoulder, he felt something shift inside of him, a flicker of possibility. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about Sarah. Maybe it was about him. Maybe it was about finding a way to move forward. "I'll think about it," David said quietly. It was all he could promise. Lily nodded, squeezing his shoulder gently. "That's all I'm asking. Just take it one step at a time." As she turned to leave, David stood in the doorway, staring after her. The weight of regret that had consumed him for so long didn't disappear with her departure. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a small shift in his heart. He didn't have to carry this burden forever. He didn't have to let it destroy him. And maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to heal. The knock at the door came in the late afternoon, and David's heart sank before he even opened it. He had been trying to avoid this moment for weeks, burying himself in work and keeping to his new empty routine. But no matter how hard he tried, Sarah kept finding ways to break through the walls he had so carefully built around himself. When he opened the door, there she stood, just like the last time, her eyes tired, red from the tears she had been holding back. Her shoulders slumped as if the weight of her own guilt was too much to bear. "David," she whispered, barely above a breath, and he could see the hesitation in her stance. She was waiting for permission to speak, waiting for some sign that this time would be different. David didn't respond right away. He stood in the doorway, blocking her entrance. The memories came flooding back, the good ones, the bad ones, and the moment everything had shattered between them. His mind was a war zone of anger, confusion, and disbelief. But there was something else too, something deeper, hurt. The hurt that had grown with each passing day since he'd walked away. "Please," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "Can we talk?" David felt the anger surge, but he held it back, the last thread of control barely holding on. "What more is there to say, Sarah?" His voice was cold, the words sharp, biting. "You've said it all already." "I know," she whispered, her eyes welling up again. "I've made so many mistakes, David, but please, let me try again. I can't live with myself knowing what I've done to you, to Noah." The mention of Noah caused a fresh wave of pain to crash over him. That name had always been a source of warmth, of love. But now, it was a constant reminder of how his entire world had been upended. "You're asking me to forgive you again," David said, his voice tight, almost choking on the words. "How many times can I hear you say you're sorry, Sarah? How many times can I watch you break me and expect me to keep coming back for more?" Sarah stepped forward, her hands trembling, but she didn't touch him. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't even deserve to ask for it. But please, David, I'm asking you to see me, not just the person who betrayed you, but the woman who still loves you, who wants to make things right." David clenched his fists, his body tensing as he fought to hold on to his composure. "You think I can just look at you like that? Like nothing ever happened? Like everything is still the same?" His voice shook, the rawness of his emotion spilling out. "I gave you everything, and you took it and threw it away. I trusted you. I trusted you more than anyone else in this world. David," her voice was soft, pleading, "I didn't want any of this. I didn't want to hurt you, but I did, and I'm so sorry for that." David's chest tightened, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The anger in him was fighting with something else now, a part of him that still wanted to believe her, that still wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could heal. But that part of him was buried deep, buried under layers of hurt and betrayal. "You're sorry?" he repeated, shaking his head, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. "You don't even understand the damage you've done. You don't know what it's like to give someone everything, to trust them with your heart, and then find out that they've been lying to you the whole time." "I do know," Sarah said, her voice breaking as she stepped closer, her eyes searching his. "I do know, and I have to live with that every single day. But please, David, don't shut me out. I want to be there for you, for Noah. I don't want to lose everything." David's gaze dropped to the floor, unable to look her in the eyes anymore. He couldn't stand seeing the woman who had broken him standing in front of him, pleading for something he wasn't sure he could give. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again," David whispered, the words feeling like lead in his mouth. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way. You took that from me, and now I'm the one who has to live with it." "I know," she said softly, the tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "I know I don't deserve anything from you, but please, give me a chance to prove that I'm not the woman who did that to you. I'm sorry. I'll do anything to fix this, to make it right." David's breath hitched in his chest. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, but he could also see the wreckage she had left in her wake. The truth was, he didn't know how to fix what had been broken, and maybe he wasn't ready to try. "I can't promise you anything," David finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't even promise that we'll ever be the same again. But I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with you here, saying you're sorry." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their ragged breathing, the unspoken weight of everything between them hanging in the air. "I don't expect you to forgive me now," Sarah said, stepping back, wiping her eyes. "I just needed you to know that I'm sorry, and that I still love you." David stood still, watching her leave, the echo of her words lingering in the room like a ghost he couldn't shake. But he couldn't make any promises. Not yet. Not when the weight of the past was still so heavy. David hadn't expected to hear from Michael Harris again. He thought that part of his life was over. The anger, the betrayal, the questions. But when his phone buzzed one evening, the name Michael Harris flashed on the screen, and David felt a wave of dread wash over him. It had been months since he last saw Michael, the man who had been the catalyst for all the pain, for everything that had gone wrong in his life. Michael had been Sarah's affair, the man whose blood now ran through Noah's veins. David had tried to forget his existence, tried to bury the anger he felt every time he thought about how Michael had taken Sarah from him. But the message sitting on his phone was about to change everything. David hesitated for a moment before swiping the screen to read the text. "David, I know you don't want to hear from me, but there's something you need to know. Something I should have told you a long time ago. Please, let me explain." David's stomach churned. He didn't want to open this door again. He didn't want to deal with Michael's lies, his excuses, his words that were never as honest as they pretended to be. But there was something in Michael's message that piqued his curiosity, something that made him pause. With a deep sigh, David sat down on the couch, his mind racing as he typed back. "What could you possibly have to say that would make a difference now?" The reply came almost instantly. "It's about Noah. I've been keeping something from you and I can't keep it inside anymore." Noah. The name hit David like a physical blow. His heart skipped a beat. He didn't know what to expect, but he had never imagined that Michael would ever reach out like this. For months, David had been trying to move forward, trying to find some semblance of peace, even if it meant severing ties with the past. But now, this message threatened to pull him right back into the chaos. David took a breath, trying to steady his thoughts. What could Michael possibly have to do with Noah now? He typed his response with a growing sense of urgency. "What about Noah? What do you mean?" Michael's reply was swift, but the words were more than David had bargained for. "I've known for a while, David, and I didn't say anything because I didn't want to complicate things more than they already were. But Noah, he deserves the truth." David's heart stopped. "The truth? What truth?" "Noah isn't just your son in name, David." Michael's message continued. "He's mine. I'm the one who's been his father all along, even though you never knew." David stared at the message for a long time. His hands shook and his head spun. He had always known Noah wasn't his biologically, but now Michael was saying something entirely different. He was claiming Noah as his own, not just as the biological father, but as someone who had been a father figure to the child David had raised as his own. The words felt like a slap across his face. "I didn't want you to know. I didn't want to make it harder for anyone. But Noah deserves the truth. He's mine, David." David's mind raced. The weight of the message settled over him and he felt like the ground beneath him was disappearing. He had already been through so much. Sarah's betrayal, the pain of knowing that Noah was not his by blood. But now it seemed as though everything he had believed about their family, about his role in Noah's life, was built on an even bigger lie. David stood up, pacing across the small apartment, his thoughts spinning wildly. The anger was building inside of him again, but it was different this time. It wasn't just about betrayal, it was about losing control. It was about everything he had fought for, the life he had tried to rebuild, coming undone. He quickly typed a response, his fingers flying over the keys, his mind filled with a storm of emotions. "I don't know what you're talking about, Michael. You've made your choices and you've ruined everything. But you don't get to come into my life now, after all this, and act like you have any claim to Noah. He's mine. He's always been mine." But even as he typed, doubt began to creep in. Was Michael right? Was there more to this than he had known? Had Michael been a father to Noah all along? Had David been living a lie? Had Noah been living a lie? The silence in the room grew heavy. David looked down at his phone again, staring at the text. The truth, the painful truth, was staring him in the face, and he didn't know if he could handle it. The phone buzzed again, Michael's response quick and firm. "I never wanted to hurt you, David. But I can't keep this secret anymore. I'm the one who has been Noah's father in every way that counts. You can't keep pretending that you weren't living a lie." David's stomach twisted, his mind fighting to come to terms with the message. He had already been betrayed by Sarah, and now Michael was trying to rewrite everything he thought he knew. The reality of it all was suffocating. He had no idea how to move forward now, no idea what to believe. Everything had changed again, and this time the truth felt more unbearable than ever. David sat at the kitchen table, staring at the photograph of Noah on his phone. It was an old picture, one from the day they'd gone to the park, Noah holding onto his hand with that bright smile plastered across his face. David had never felt prouder. He had been Noah's father in every sense of the word. He had raised him, loved him, protected him. The boy in the picture was his. But now, the world felt different. His mind kept returning to the message from Michael, the man who had claimed that he had been a father to Noah, that he was the one who truly knew what it meant to care for him. David's chest tightened as the words echoed in his mind. "I've been Noah's father in every way that counts." How could that be true? How could Michael have taken that place, that role in his son's life? David's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. He didn't need to ask who it was. Noah had been quiet lately, staying in his room more often than usual. His behavior had changed ever since David's confrontation with Sarah, ever since the truth of his paternity had come crashing down. David stood and opened the door, finding Noah standing there, his small frame filled with uncertainty. His eyes were wide, and he looked up at David with a mixture of confusion and sadness. "Dad," Noah said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can we talk?" David felt a lump form in his throat. "Of course, buddy," he replied, stepping aside to let him in. He could see that Noah wasn't the same carefree child he had been just a few months ago. There was something in his eyes, something that spoke of innocence lost, of questions that a boy his age shouldn't have to ask. Noah climbed into the chair across from him, his gaze fixed on the table between them. "I heard you talking to Mom," he said quietly, his voice trembling. About who my real dad is." David's heart sank. He had tried so hard to shield Noah from this, to keep him safe from the storm that had been tearing through their lives. But the truth had a way of finding its way into the most fragile spaces. "Noah," David began, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't know how to explain this, how to tell his son the truth without breaking him. "What did you hear exactly? I heard you say that. Michael is my real dad." Noah's words stung more than anything David had ever felt. The boy's innocence, the trust he had placed in him, was slipping away. "Is that true?" David swallowed hard, his mind racing. This was it, the moment he had feared. How could he answer this? How could he tell Noah that everything he thought he knew, his family, his identity, wasn't the truth? That David wasn't his real father? That Michael was the one who had been there in ways David never imagined? David looked at Noah, seeing the fear in his eyes. He wasn't just confused, he was hurt, and David could feel every ounce of it. "I'm so sorry, Noah," David said, his voice shaking. "I know this is a lot. It's a lot for both of us, but the truth is, I'm not your biological father." Noah's face crumpled, the tears welling in his eyes as he struggled to understand. "But you're my dad, aren't you? You've always been there for me. You always loved me." David's heart shattered at the words. "I do love you, Noah. I've always loved you. I'll always love you. Nothing can change that." Noah wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, his small voice breaking. "So, Michael, he's my real dad? He's the one who should be here? Not you? David's chest tightened as the realization hit him. The hurt in Noah's voice wasn't just about the truth. It was about David's place in his life. The boy who had called him Dad all these years, the boy who had trusted him more than anyone else, was now questioning that bond. "No, buddy, you're my son, always," David said softly, reaching out to place a hand on Noah's trembling shoulder. "You're my son no matter what. What Michael did or didn't do doesn't change what I've done for you. I'm here for you, and I always will be." Noah looked up at him, the confusion still evident on his face. But there was something else there, too. It was that flicker of understanding. The truth had hurt him, but David's words, his reassurance, seemed to provide some small measure of comfort. "I'm sorry," Noah whispered. "I didn't mean to make you upset." David smiled weakly, wiping a tear from his own cheek. "You didn't, Noah. You didn't do anything wrong." For a long moment they sat in silence, both of them trying to make sense of the pieces of their lives that had been torn apart. David wanted so desperately to make it right, to somehow protect Noah from the hurt and confusion he himself had been battling. "I don't know if things will ever be the same again," David said softly, more to himself than to Noah. "But I'll always be here for you, no matter what." Noah nodded slowly, the smallest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make David believe that maybe, just maybe, they could get through this together. David had avoided the reunion for as long as he could. It wasn't that he wanted to escape his past. It was that every time he thought about facing those who had once known him, the weight of his personal failures pressed down on him like 1,000 pounds. But when his old friend Sam reached out, urging him to attend, David reluctantly agreed. He convinced himself it would be a chance to reconnect with old friends, to pretend for just a little while that life hadn't changed so drastically. As he arrived at the venue, the familiar faces greeted him, their smiles wide and welcoming. At first, everything seemed fine. David smiled back, exchanging pleasantries, catching up on life's trivialities. But beneath the surface, he was more aware than ever of the distance between him and these people. They didn't know what he had been through, what he was still going through. They couldn't understand that the man they once knew wasn't the same. It wasn't until Sarah walked into the room that David's calm exterior started to crack. She was standing by the bar, nervously looking around. When her eyes met his, she froze. For a moment, there was nothing but the heavy silence between them, the air thick with unspoken words. Then, as if pulled by an invisible force, Sarah began walking toward him. David's stomach churned, but he couldn't move. His feet were frozen in place. "David," she said softly, standing before him. Her eyes were red, her face tired. She looked like someone who had been through hell and back, but he wasn't sure if that would make him feel any differently about her. "Sarah," David replied, his voice colder than he intended. He wasn't sure how to speak to her anymore. They had been through so much. She had broken everything, and now here she was, standing in front of him like nothing had changed. "I didn't think you'd come," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, clearly not knowing what to say next. "But I'm glad you did." David said nothing, his gaze drifting away from hers. He wasn't sure if he was glad or not. This reunion was supposed to be a chance to get away from everything that had happened. But here she was, forcing him to relive it. Just then, another voice interrupted them. "David, Sarah?" Sam called, walking up to them with a broad smile. "I'm glad you two are talking again. We've all missed you both." David's heart sank at the mention of the word again. He didn't know what Sam thought they were doing, but it certainly didn't feel like anything close to a reunion. It felt like a rehearsal for all the apologies and half-hearted attempts to patch things up. Before David could say anything, Sarah spoke up. "I don't know if we'll ever really be able to fix things, Sam, but it's a start." David stiffened. The audacity of her words, "it's a start," felt like salt in a wound that had never healed. A few more old acquaintances joined the group, and soon the conversation shifted to safer topics. But for David, it was all a blur. His mind was elsewhere, trying to grapple with everything that had happened, trying to understand how he was supposed to move forward when the past kept crashing into him like this. Then, out of nowhere, Michael appeared. His presence in the room felt like a bomb going off. The crowd seemed to part as Michael walked in, his gaze scanning the room until it landed on David. David felt a rush of heat rise to his face. Michael's expression was unreadable, but there was a certain confidence in the way he carried himself, like he had won something. And maybe he had. After all, he was Noah's biological father. Sarah saw him too, her expression flickering between surprise and guilt. "Michael," she whispered, her voice betraying her. David's hands clenched into fists. This was the last thing he needed right now. The very man who had shattered his family was standing there, casually mingling, as though nothing had ever happened. "David," Michael said, his voice loud enough to cut through the low hum of the crowd. "It's been a long time." David's jaw tightened. He was struggling to keep his composure, to not let the anger overtake him. But it was difficult. Everything he had built, everything he had worked so hard for, was in ruins because of this man. "What do you want, Michael?" David asked, the words sharp as a knife. Michael raised an eyebrow, seemingly unfazed by David's hostility. "I thought we could at least talk, try to put the past behind us, for Noah's sake." Noah's name hung in the air, heavy and painful. David's heart squeezed at the thought of his son, the boy who had no idea how deeply his life had been altered. Noah was innocent in all of this, and now, in front of everyone, David was left to face the harsh truth. Michael had been there for Noah in ways David never realized, and that truth stung more than anything. "You've already done enough damage," David spat, his voice shaking with anger. "You don't get to come here, act like everything's fine. You've already ruined everything." Sarah's face went pale. She stepped forward, looking between the two men. "David, please, let's just try to get through tonight without—" But David wasn't listening. He turned and walked away, unable to be in the same room with either of them any longer. He needed air, needed space, needed to escape the suffocating reality of everything that had been exposed. As he stepped out into the cool night air, David felt the weight of everything crashing down on him. The lies, the betrayal, the hurt. His life, it seemed, was no longer his own to control. It belonged to the past, to the lies, to the people who had broken him. David sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the phone in his hand. The text from Sarah had come hours ago, but he had yet to respond. He couldn't bring himself to open her message. Each word, each apology, felt like another layer of weight pressing down on him. It was impossible to move past what had happened, impossible to forget the betrayal, the lies, and the devastation they had caused. But here she was, reaching out again, asking for one last chance. The anger had dulled somewhat since the confrontation at the reunion. Now the rawness was replaced with a quiet exhaustion. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing you had to make a choice, but unsure if you could bring yourself to take the leap. He looked at the phone screen again. "David, I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking you to hear me out one more time. Please, for Noah, for us." The words lingered in the air, heavy with hope, but to David they felt hollow. Could he really go back to that life? Back to the woman who had broken him? Could he trust her again, knowing that their foundation had been built on a lie? No, he wasn't sure he could. But then there was Noah, his son. The boy who had looked up at him with such trust and love, who had called him Dad even when the world around them was crumbling. Noah didn't deserve any of this. He didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire of his parents' mistakes. David took a deep breath, his mind spinning. He thought about the time they had spent together, the bond they had built. He thought about the days when Noah had smiled up at him with that innocent, untainted love, the same love that was now in jeopardy. He knew what was at stake. If he chose to ignore Sarah's message, if he chose to walk away completely, there would be no going back. Noah would grow up with only the echoes of a broken family, and David would never be able to live with that. David's phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his thoughts. This time it was a voicemail. It was from Sarah. He hesitated, but with a shaky hand he pressed play. "David, please. I don't know how to make this right, but I need you to understand something. I've spent so many nights thinking about everything, about the mistakes I've made, and I've realized something I didn't know back then, but I know now. You were right. You were the one who truly gave everything. And I didn't. But David, I'm still here, and I want to fix this. I can't do it alone. Please, for Noah, if nothing else, let me try. Let me prove that I can be the person you need, the person you deserve." Her voice cracked at the end, and David felt a pang in his chest. She was broken. He could hear it in her voice. She was asking for redemption, for a chance to show him that she could be the woman she once was. But the question lingered. Could he give her that chance? He looked at the phone again, his fingers trembling as he typed out a response. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Sarah, but I can't walk away. Not from Noah, not from what we had. I'll listen. I'll try, but I can't promise anything." His heart raced as he hit send. The weight of his decision was heavier than anything he had ever felt. It wasn't just about Sarah. It was about Noah's future, about the kind of man he wanted to be, about the kind of father he could still be despite everything that had happened. David stood up, walking toward the window. He needed to clear his head, to think. The weight of the choice he had just made pressed down on him like 1,000 pounds. Was this the right thing to do? Could he forgive her? Could they ever be the family they once were? He didn't have all the answers. But as he looked out into the dark night, the streetlights casting long shadows across the empty road, he knew that he couldn't keep running forever. The past was never going to be something he could outrun. And maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to move forward, for Noah, for himself, and for the family he still wanted to fight for. Days passed since David made the choice to respond to Sarah's message, and though there was a small part of him that felt a glimmer of hope, the rest of him remained consumed by the overwhelming weight of the past. He couldn't escape the images, the lies, the hurt, the conversations he had had with Sarah, but most of all the image of Noah's innocent eyes, now filled with confusion, sadness, and questions. How could he ever explain to him what had happened? How could he undo the damage that had already been done? The silence of his apartment felt suffocating, and he found himself lost in thought, trapped in the chaos of his emotions. He hadn't yet seen Sarah in person since he replied to her message. It had been a few days, but he knew she was waiting for a sign, for a chance to talk, to make things right. But David wasn't sure how much he had to give. He wasn't sure he could ever fully open up again. A knock on the door broke him from his reverie. David felt a wave of unease wash over him as he stood up, moving slowly toward the door. He didn't need to check who it was. He could feel Sarah's presence just beyond the threshold. When he opened the door, Sarah stood there, looking every bit as broken as she had the last time he saw her. There were no smiles, no words of reassurance, only the quiet acceptance that she had already lost so much. "David," she whispered, her voice small. I didn't want to push you, but I had to see you. I need you to know that I'm here, that I'm still willing to fight for us, for everything we lost." David stared at her, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. He didn't know what to say. He had been through this before, the back and forth, the promises, the apologies, but something felt different now. There was a shift in the air, something fragile, yet real. He didn't have the answers, but perhaps he didn't need to find them all right now. He nodded, his voice low. "I don't know where this will go, Sarah. I don't know if I can just forget what happened, but maybe we can try to figure it out together." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She just nodded, as if she already knew that this journey of healing wasn't going to be easy. "I'll wait for as long as it takes. I'll be patient. I'll do whatever I can to prove that I'm here for you, David." David didn't answer immediately. His mind was racing, still too caught up in the turmoil that had consumed him for so long. He thought of Noah, and the image of the boy's innocent face made his chest tighten. Could he really do this? Could he allow himself to trust Sarah again, knowing that trust had been so easily shattered? "I don't expect you to just forgive me, David," Sarah continued softly. "I don't even know if you will. But I've spent every moment since we last spoke thinking about what I did, how wrong I was. I was selfish, and I hurt you, and I hurt Noah. I'm sorry, I can't take it back, but I can promise you that I'll spend the rest of my life making things right." David swallowed hard. It was hard to hear the sincerity in her voice. He had never imagined hearing these words from her, not after everything. But she was right. They both had a lot of work ahead of them if they were going to rebuild anything. "I want to believe you, Sarah," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "I really do. But I can't just jump back into this. I can't pretend that everything's okay. I need time, and I need to know that you're ready to fight too, for us, for Noah." Sarah nodded, her expression determined. "I will, I promise. I'm ready to fight, whatever it takes." David felt a flicker of something inside him, a sense of hope, however small. Maybe this was the first step in the long journey toward healing, toward rebuilding. Maybe there was a chance, however faint, that they could find their way back to each other. But it wasn't just about them. It was about Noah, the boy who had already been through so much, the boy who still believed that David was his father, no matter what the truth was. He had to protect that innocence, that love. He had to fight for Noah's happiness, even if it meant facing the hardest truths. "I'm not promising anything, Sarah," David said quietly, "but I'll try, for Noah and for us." Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she didn't speak. She just nodded, as if understanding that this was the beginning of something new, something fragile and uncertain. David watched her leave, his heart torn between the desire to protect himself from further pain and the hope that maybe, just maybe, this time things would be different. He didn't know if they could heal, but he knew he had to try. For Noah, for himself, for the family they had once been. And so, as he closed the door behind him, David took a deep breath. The road ahead would be long, filled with more pain and more healing, but at least now he wasn't walking it alone. The silence in David's apartment was deafening, the quiet hum of the world outside barely reaching him as he sat in the middle of his empty living room. His thoughts were a whirlwind, the weight of his decision pressing down on him with every passing second. It had been days since he spoke to Sarah, days since he had last seen her, and yet the lingering ache in his chest hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown. His phone buzzed, breaking the stillness. It was another message from Sarah. He had read them all, each one more desperate than the last. "David, please, can we talk? Just once more, I swear it'll be the last time." He stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the reply button. He had made his choice, hadn't he? He had said he would try for Noah, for himself. But the truth was, the closer he got to the moment of reckoning, the more he doubted his own strength. There was a knock on the door. David's heart skipped, and for a brief moment he was frozen. His mind raced. Who could it be? He stood up slowly, walking toward the door, his body stiff, reluctant to face whoever was on the other side. When he opened it, Sarah was standing there, her eyes swollen from crying. She didn't speak at first, just stood there, as if trying to gather the courage to break the silence that hung between them. "David," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking, "can we just talk?" David's chest tightened. He had thought he was ready for this moment, but the sight of her, the woman who had once been the center of his world, brought back a flood of memories, both good and painful. The words he had rehearsed in his head all week seemed to evaporate the moment he saw her standing there. "You've said it all, Sarah," David replied, his voice low and strained. "You've apologized, I've heard it, and I've tried to understand, tried to find a way to forgive. But I don't know if I can anymore." Sarah nodded, as if she already knew. She wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself. "I don't blame you, David. I know you don't owe me forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve it. But I'm asking for one last chance, not for me, for Noah, please. I can't live with myself if I don't at least try." David felt a lump form in his throat at the mention of Noah's name, the boy who had been caught in the middle of all their pain, the child who still didn't fully understand the fracture in their world. David could never forget that innocent face, the trust that Noah had placed in him. That trust was something he had promised to protect, and yet here he was, standing on the edge of a decision that could either heal or destroy what little remained of their family. "I don't know if we can fix this," David whispered, his voice barely audible. "You've hurt me more than I ever thought possible, Sarah. You broke us, you broke Noah, and now I'm stuck trying to figure out if there's anything worth saving." Sarah stepped closer, her hands trembling. "I understand if you can't forgive me, but I'm asking you to believe that I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. I'll fight for us, David. For Noah. I will never give up." David closed his eyes, fighting the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that she could be the woman she once was, that they could somehow rebuild what had been destroyed. But the pain was still too raw. The trust, once shattered, felt impossible to put back together. "Noah deserves better than this," David said quietly, his eyes flickering toward the door where Sarah stood. "He deserves a family that doesn't fall apart, a family that's whole." "I know," Sarah whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I've been selfish and I've hurt you both. I don't know if I can ever make up for it, but I want to try. I want to be there for you, for Noah, in every way that matters." David's heart ached as he looked at her, his mind a tangled mess of conflicting emotions. Was it possible to forgive? Was it possible to rebuild a life that had been broken beyond recognition? "I can't promise you anything, Sarah," David finally said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of finality. "But I need to move forward, for Noah, for myself, and if that means walking away, then I'll walk away, because I can't keep holding on to something that's gone." Sarah's face crumpled as the finality of his words hit her. She took a step back, as if physically feeling the distance between them grow. "I understand," she whispered. "I'm sorry, David. I'll never stop loving you. But I know I can't ask you to stay if you're not ready." David stood there, watching her turn to walk away, knowing that this would be the last time he saw her like this. The last time they'd have a chance at what could have been. His heart felt heavy, weighed down with the burden of everything they had lost. As she walked away, David closed the door behind her, the sound echoing through the emptiness of the apartment. And in that moment he knew he had made his choice. There would be no going back. There was only moving forward, one step at a time.